this view is everything. Shit, I could get used to this. That's right. You can see a lot more when you're standing on the top floor and stuff.
Now let's talk a little bit about the major agenda, which is compartment D of our system. There's a reason major agenda is put in place where it is. Remember, agendas must be negotiated. There must be an agreement between both parties of what's going to take place. So major agenda must be put in place prior to our ever providing a solution. So before we ever present our critical pieces to the solution to the puzzle in the negotiation, we want to have a major agenda in place. Now let's talk about major agenda for a moment. There's really no difference in what makes up a major agenda. There's 5 parts, 2 are required. 1, problems. What are the problems we see in this negotiation? What are we addressing? Let me give you an example. You've uncovered all of the vision of pain in A, all the visual problems everyone sees. You've done a great job of that. You have absolutely a full budget from the adversary. You have all the decision process uncovered and vision collected from those decision makers. So now you're about ready to present your solution, but there's a major problem. The solution is going to be much more difficult than they had hoped for. They have a poor vision of what it's going to take to solve this problem. That's a problem you've got to deal with. That's a problem that has to go into an agenda and be dealt with before you spill all of your solution information in the presentation step, which we'll talk about next. Or maybe the solution is going to be much higher in cost than they anticipated. Or maybe the solution is going to have much more risk than they had hoped to take. But any problem you see that could interfere with a successful conclusion is a problem you have to work with. It's a problem you have to present in this negotiation, and you must negotiate it out. You must negotiate their agreement that they see the problem and they acknowledge it. Now, our baggage is what we carry into the negotiation. If we have a history of experience with this adversary, there may be some baggage involved. So we want to be sure that if we can't dump that baggage, then we want to present it, and it becomes a problem. Notice it actually transitions from step 2 up to step 1 and becomes a problem to be dealt with. For example, let's say that our baggage is that they were slow payers in the last contract, and that's not acceptable this time. Well, that could be a real problem. So we want to transition that up to the problem and deal with it. Their baggage, the only time in the system that we talk about allowing you to make assumptions, that is step number 3. And if there's a history again, and we can assume that it might repeat itself, that could be a problem. Now, normally we try to dump any baggage and not deal with it at all. But if we can't get rid of this and can't dump it, it moves to number 1 and becomes a problem. Now, what we want is our 4th step, and this is a required piece to the agenda. There may not be problems, there may not be baggage, there may not be any assumptions on our part, but we must know what we want. We must do step 4, and we must clearly explain what we want. Now, remember, we talked earlier about a decision. So we almost always want to give them permission to reject what we're about to present. Of course, we hope they'll embrace, but we want to be sure they're comfortable knowing they can reject. And all we ask is a discussion. If there's a rejection, all we ask is an in-depth discussion on where we fell short. Step 5, of course, is what happens next. And it could be that in-depth discussion we just talked about. That could be what happens next, or it could be if they embrace what we recommend, then we schedule the next steps to be sure that that gets implemented. But the key is that major agenda must be put in position before we ever present our valuable information, and it must be negotiated. Now, I want to be sure that you have your arms around this in the what we want area. They may say to you, look, we need 3 days, we need 5 days, we need 2 weeks to make this decision. And if that's the case and you agree to it, that's fine. But bear in mind, you must 3+ this agenda, that decision will be made in 3 weeks. And you'll ask that question 3 times. And in the what next step is you'll actually nail down the date and time when you'll receive their rejection or their acceptance of what you're proposing. Remember, step 4D is major agenda, and it must always be in place prior to going to step E, presentation. So let's talk about presentation. Goodness knows you've been doing that your whole business career, and you're learning how to do PowerPoints, and you're learning how to put all these fancy presentations together, and that's all great. But I've got a couple things for you I want you to think about. The greatest presentation you'll ever give, they'll never see. Now let me say that again. I know that's kind of crazy, but the greatest presentation you'll ever participate in is one they'll never see. Let me tell you a story. This was a $220 million capital equipment contract with one of the largest adversaries in that arena in the world. This was a negotiation to remove the incumbent capital equipment supplier from the floors of this industry giant and replace them with my client's equipment. When I say to you the greatest presentation you'll ever give, they'll never see, is we actually negotiated with the chief operating officer of this industry giant. We had so much vision of problems and pain that we negotiated an agenda that we would not even attend the presentation. We would sit outside. And he, the chief operating officer of the adversary, would make the presentation of our solutions to his committee himself. So they made the presentation to themselves. It was an amazing, amazing event. My client got full price for their capital equipment, and we didn't even make the presentation. Now, just yesterday, I negotiated an agenda with an organization where the chairman of the board made a presentation to his board of directors of enrolling all of his organization in the Camp Institute of Negotiation. So they literally presented to themselves our information. Now, how do you do that? How do you get such agreements that enable you to, shall we say, give you ever opportunity for presentation success? Here's the key. The key is A, the vision of the problems, the vision of the pain. If you've done a great job in A, it's easy to negotiate such agendas. But more importantly, how do you stop them from seeing a presentation? How do you stop them from doing that? If you're in their world, if you're dealing with their vision, and you have prioritized those and negotiated with them that here's the biggest problem 1, number 2 problem, number 3, number 4, and you've laid those out in proper order, and you've 3+ that with the decision process, you will find that when you begin to present to 1, when you present concisely to 2, you present concisely to 3, you present to 4, you're in their world, they won't see your presentation. That's presentation step, and that's really all I have for you in presentation. So let's move to the final step. Let's move to the step that allows us to tie multiple engagements together. Picture a nautilus shell. It circles, it seems to go forever. Negotiations can absolutely appear that way also. They can almost appear in a sphere. And how do we get those connections, that chain started, so we become all-encompassing? That's where we call upon our prep end step. The prep end step allows us to prepare for the next negotiation negotiate the mini agenda that moves us into the next negotiations, or allows us to transition to end the negotiation. The key here is this is your connection, your bridge to other negotiations. Now, for example, you remember I talked earlier about the CEO, the head of engineering, the head of services, and the head of sales engaging on this request for proposal. That's 4 different negotiations. We have 4 different structures feeding one large structure. How do we connect them? We connect them with the prep end step through a mini agenda. So for example, at the end of the CEO negotiation, all we wanted from that negotiation was directions on how best to work with the board of directors if that's what we wanted, and there are 8 boards of directors. We now have a prep end step to 8 new negotiations to 8 new miniature structures. So D and E, the final 2 compartments, presentation and prep end, that's our transition into the next negotiation, or it ends negotiation. But I'd like you to get your arms around that. That's where you're going to connect to the next negotiation in that prep end step. Now I want to take you back to behaviors for a moment and mini agenda. When we structure that agenda, we build good, solid interrogative questions. We set our behavioral goals of 3+, nurture, reverse, connect. We use all of those tools as we advance the negotiation through the structure. I want to be sure you see this, so let me do a recap. Let's be sure you have the vision, the structure, the compartments. Remember I talked about the crane moving back and forth. You're going to move back and forth through your structure of negotiation. You're going to be able to go from front to back, back to front. Remember, you're going to use your mini agenda to negotiate going back and going forward. So keep that in mind. You're going to approach your structure just like that steel mill. Remember the crane? I talked about the crane. As compartments in the mill needed to be filled for the mill's running and the mill's success, your compartments are going to be filled. And you're going to move back and forth through your structure to fill those compartments. If one of those compartments aren't full, it's going to give you a warning, impending problems. Success is driven by the more you work to fill those compartments. Use your mini agenda just like the crane in the mill. You move through the compartments, be sure they're full. Now let's talk about A. I just want to be sure that you have a vision of the importance, the dynamics of A. A is their vision, their world, their pain. It's the place where you are always safe. You're going to find that the moment you transition into your world and start talking about what you're doing, what you're delivering, what you want to talk about, you're going to lose that safety. So you always want to transition to A and be in their world. Remember, the tools you're going to use are all of your behaviors we've talked about. That life raft, that ejection seat, that driving force in a negotiation, their vision, that's where they're going to make their decisions. That's going to have to be in place. So that's compartment A. Then we talked about budget and the importance of building the budget, the time, the energy, the money, the emotion. Remember, we talked about how we make decisions, and the more budget involved in negotiation, the clearer the vision's going to be, and vice versa. The clearer the vision, the more we can magnify the budget, all in the name of decision making. C, the third compartment. We cannot present our critical information. We can't spill our beans to the unqualified. We have to work very hard to dig into the decision process. Again, a lot of mini agendas moving through the decision process, gathering up all of those individuals, all of their vision, and keeping track of that. That goes in our structure. D, major agenda must be in place prior to spilling our information. E, presentation. We must work to give a presentation they don't see. Remember, the key to doing that is being able to prioritize all those visions. And then lastly, in the last compartment, the prep end step, it's very, very important that we realize we negotiate the bridge to the next negotiation structure. That's how you tie your negotiations into multiple negotiations. That structure provides you the step-by-step roadmap to your success in negotiations. I mentioned early in the program that we were going to blend neuroscience in here just to help you discover that these things are scientific in nature and important that you be able to get your arms around this. In neuroscience, the neuroscientists talk about growth mindset and fixed mindset. And many times we get ourselves locked into a mindset and don't even understand it or realize it. A long time ago, as a young man, I was flying jets, and I was thinking in terms of maneuvering the aircraft as a tactic. And one of my flight instructors said to me, "Camp, you're thinking tactically. You can't think tactically, you've got to think with principle. You've got to work with principle. Principle defeats tactic every single time." If you're thinking tactic is something that people can take advantage of with principle. So what we're talking about today in our system of negotiation is all a series of principles. This is not tactical. For example, as a young man, when I was selling those water softeners we talked about early in the program, I actually was so mad at my failure that I went out and demanded people tell me no. I did it in a nice way, but when I first did that and had that success, I thought I was pretty slick. I thought I'd come up with a tactic. I thought I really was on top of it. But it wasn't until I really discovered the right to veto and that definition from the Oxford Dictionary. People have the right to say no. I discovered it's a foundation principle of what we're doing. And it's served me well as a principle ever since. So what I'm asking you to think about is tactic versus principle. Don't fall into a trap as you listen to this program, as you try some of these things, have some success. Don't pat yourself on the back. Don't celebrate that you're double, triple reverse or your Statue of Liberty play, what we call in football. That tactic, that trick is a principle. It's not. It's not something you can count on. Delve into this. Dig into the material. Become a student of the principles, of the rules, the laws of human behavior, and how agreements are really made. You'll find that as long as you're principled, there's not a Pecos tactic or a win-win tactic or any of those tricks that people pull upon you or that you read about in books from gurus who claim they've got the tactics and tricks to give you the advantage. Don't fall into that trap. Study the principles. As I study the great thinkers, and I'm currently studying Washington, Washington was a purpose-driven person, and he worked very hard at creating vision for his troops, including leading them into battle, including them helping them discover the value of their sacrifice to bring the country about, to bring the United States of America into being. Those are all principles. All the great ones were principle-driven. They're not tricksters or tactics. It's principle. Principle always defeats tactic. Please keep that in mind. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about tactic versus principle. We face tactics every day in the world of negotiation. Pecos negotiators, and we will talk about Pecos in detail in the program, but they're tactic-driven. For example, one of their tactics is to attack the other party, to call them a poor partner, a weak partner, an arrogant partner. And they'll accuse you of destroying the relationship. And they'll push their tactics to drive your emotions, to create fear, to bring about compromise. One such situation took place with one of the world's largest computer manufacturers, who has to remain nameless. But they told my client that they were being replaced, they were being thrown out. And it was simply because my client wouldn't give the price decreases that they demanded. Now, when I say that principle defeats tactic, let me explain. We know that decisions are 100% emotional, driven by vision. And the purchasing person pushing that sales team of my client demanded the price reduction or they were going to be thrown out. Now, remember in a system we talked about negotiating with the qualified. Well, who's responsible for the decisions in the organization and the adversary? In this case, it was the fab managers who held all the responsibility for financial production and the P&L, the profit and loss statement for that factory. So who should we be negotiating with? Now, we knew that our product was superior. We knew that our delivery record was impeccable. We knew that if we didn't get a price increase, it was going to be very difficult to function in the environment and to continue the level of service and research and development required to keep our customer, the adversary, at the front of the game. So we opened negotiations across the spectrum with 12 factories and explained to them and helped them discover that we were, unfortunately, being removed. We couldn't help it. Purchasing had demanded a price decrease, and it was unfortunate, but we couldn't continue to supply the products and services and advance the technology without the R&D dollars, so we actually needed a 7% price increase. Purchasing was demanding an 8% price reduction, and we knew we needed 7% price increase. So their tactics of accusing us of being a bad partner, destroying the relationship, was disingenuous at best. We knew principally that if we drove the vision of failure and in our decision-making process, and we did, the outcome was assured. Our principled negotiation system defeated those tactics. We got our price increase. That's a 15% swing from what they demanded. That's an example for you of principle defeating tactic. I want to talk about some tactics that are used against you out there. Now, these are well thought through, and what I'm going to talk about is so prevalent that it's actually destroyed industry in America and in other parts of the world. This whole strategy that I'm going to talk to you about takes dramatic advantage of win-win negotiators. So let's talk about it. It's called the Program for the Improvement and Cost Optimization of Suppliers, PICOS. Now let me give you a view of the overall strategy. The overall strategy of PICOS is to get immediate price reductions. Please remember, 2/3 of our European profit was generated by price reductions we got from our suppliers. Second, secure long-term price reductions from all suppliers. Third, sort out the first and second tier suppliers. Only single source with significant price reductions, 18 to 40%, that are firmly backed and tied into fixed price long-term contracts. How's that for a strategy? Now let me tell you exactly what's wrong with the PICOS strategy. Let's talk about the tactical overview. It says, establish well-qualified, well-trained, and articulate purchasing clones in all business units to implement the following practices. Plan extensive supplier price reductions for each model. Send out inquiries around the world in search of the lowest unit price. Establish short and long-term price reduction targets and go very low. Know your potential winning suppliers and their competitors inside and out, long before you begin to negotiate. And always play first and second tier suppliers against each other. Always use these underlying themes. Identify and parade the enemy as our competitive companies, not us. Understand the balance of power between each supplier. Keep taking the temperature with vendor ratings and supplier council meetings. Offer exaggerated growth and future order quantities as bonuses. Start working with the likely winning suppliers as early as possible on price reductions that are termed cost reduction improvements. Before awarding the deals, establish long-term contracts as the ultimate goal. Establish the long-term contract rules. Establish that non-price factors like tooling costs and R&D are not allowed. Resist any suggestion that supplier costs are not controllable. For example, raw materials. We don't give price increases because of their raw materials. Focus all activities on dramatically and immediately reducing the unit price. Tie up the short-term unit price. Nibble away at the price and terms even at the midnight hour. Always appear to be in desperate hurry, but never take as much time as needed. Pull the long-term deal out of the cupboard. Always intensely squeeze more out. Get the supplier to sign. Managing the chosen suppliers. Introduce suppliers to our corporate commodity councils. They've got to believe that what they bring to us is a commodity. Totally involve each supplier's top and upper management. Get commitments that the supplier's middle management would never make. Request that each supplier provide you with detailed information on the cost, profit structure of the products it currently or proposes to sell us. Don't be afraid to ask for their financials. Don't accept raw material indexes as cost information when a supplier proposes a price increase. Get the cost profit information. Establish a friend-buddy relationship with middle and low-level supplier peoples to pass cost profit and competitive information to us. Turn them into our agents. Be prepared indirectly and under pressure to bluff and lie. Destabilize each supplier's people with many urgent meetings and many demands for more and in-depth information. Set new deadlines for suppliers to meet, but defer decisions to increase their anxiety. That's the outline of PICOS. How many different ways can they drive your budget if you have a win-win mindset? If you have a compromise-based mindset, you're in trouble. Now, how do we tie this to neuroscience? All of these tactics, all of this strategy is designed to take advantage of a win-win compromise mindset. If you believe that decisions are made logically, if you believe that compromise is required in negotiation, and if you have that mindset, you have real problems against this strategy. The fear will be overwhelming. You have no control, no chance of aligning a team with such a mindset. The fear will be rampant. People will be unwitting agents. Your own people will literally argue for the adversary in these engagements. Now, neuroscience tells us that the most critical piece to the puzzle of mindset is growth mindset. And what that means is that we recognize consciously that the human mind has a tendency to trap itself in a fixed mindset. So if our mindset is fixed, that the only way to negotiate is with win-win and compromise, we don't stand a chance against such strategies. That's what you're witnessing out in the field. The world has spent millions, if not tens of millions of dollars in training PICOS negotiators to take advantage of win-win and compromise. It's very interesting. There are organizations that will spend 30 and 40 days in training, full days, to be able to master these tactics. So when someone uses the word commodity, if your mindset is that you are bringing forward a commodity, I don't care what it is, then you're locked in a fixed mindset that's really going to hurt you in negotiations. If you are not aware that they're bluffing and lying is part of what they're doing, then you're in a weak position. Let's talk about what you're up against. PICOS, the program for improving cost optimization in suppliers. And what's interesting, if you take the word commodity, what does that word mean to you? What is a commodity? Or take the word partner. What is a partner? Or take the word relationship. What is a relationship? When you look at those words and you go into dictionary, a commodity to me is corn or wheat or soybeans or hog bellies. A relationship to me means some things work together somehow, but without a family relationship, without a word in front of it, it doesn't register with me. So what's going on? What's taking place? What's happening here? Well, what's happening is that the mindset, and the neuroscientists teach us that we have a tendency as human beings, our brains lock themselves into a mindset. It's a fixed mindset. And that fixed mindset becomes the holy grail of how we think and how we check our decisions that are emotional. So think about in terms of this. When we have a fixed mindset that compromise is required in negotiation, we open up a whole can of weak worms that cost us a fortune.
This view is everything. Shit, I could get used to this. That's right. You can see a lot more when you're standing on the top floor and stuff.